Most people in the outer colonies stopped hearing cries for help after a while. Ethan Cole never learned how. The wind howled across docking Sector 9 hard enough to shake frost from the rusted cargo cranes above the station yard. Thin sheets of ice scraped along the metal walkways with a sound like broken glass dragged across steel. Somewhere deep inside the refinery complex, an emergency siren pulsed in tired intervals, half drowned beneath the storm battering the colony from the frozen wasteland outside. Ethan adjusted the collar of his worn thermal jacket and kept walking. His boots clanged softly against the grated catwalk as pale vapor curled from the vents beneath his feet. Midnight shifts on Vera Station always smelled the same. Burned coolant, old machinery, cheap recycled oxygen. The scent settled into your lungs until you stopped noticing it. The station lights flickered overhead, throwing weak bands of yellow across the corridor walls. Half the bulbs hadn't been replaced in months. Corporate stopped caring about maintenance the moment the mining yields dropped below quota. Ethan glanced down at the cracked tablet in his hand. Bay 14. Unauthorized power fluctuation detected. Possible electrical fault. He sighed under his breath. Of course it's Bay 14. Nobody used Bay 14 anymore. The storage section sat near the station's outer rim where the insulation barely worked and the cold seeped through the walls like something alive. Most workers avoided it after dark because the place sounded haunted whenever the wind hit the exterior hull. Ethan keyed open the security door. The old mechanism groaned before sliding sideways with a reluctant hiss. Freezing air rolled over him instantly. The temperature inside had to be under 20 degrees Fahrenheit. His breath fogged in front of his face as dim emergency lights blinked weakly above rows of abandoned shipping containers. The cavernous base stretched into darkness, cluttered with forgotten cargo pallets and old transport rigs draped in frost. Somewhere ahead, metal rattled softly. Ethan stopped walking. Another sound followed. Not machinery. Breathing. Weak. Uneven. He frowned and reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, passing over frozen floor panels and stacks of sealed freight crates until it landed on something near the far wall. Chains. His stomach tightened. A small figure sat curled against a cargo container beneath a failing overhead light. At first, Ethan thought she was dead. Her skin had the pale blue-green color of frozen seawater beneath moonlight. Long silver hair clung to her shoulders in tangled strands, partially covering a thin metallic collar around her neck. One side of her breathing mask was cracked, forcing faint bursts of vapor into the freezing air with every shaky breath. She couldn't have been more than 20 by human standards. Maybe younger. The chains attached to her wrists disappeared into a locking bracket bolted to the wall behind her. Cargo markings covered the nearby crate in faded black lettering. Biological property, transfer denied. Ethan stared at the words for several seconds. Something twisted quietly inside his chest. The girl slowly lifted her head. Golden eyes met his through the darkness. Not angry, not threatening, just exhausted. Like she already knew how this story ended. Ethan crouched carefully a few feet away, lowering the flashlight so it wouldn't blind her. "Hey," he said softly. "You understand English?" The girl flinched at the sound of his voice. Her fingers tightened weakly against the chain. For a moment, she looked ready to apologize for existing. Then her cracked lips parted. "Please," she whispered through the damaged respirator. "If you're here to take me back, don't let them wake me first." The storm outside slammed against the station hull hard enough to rattle the bay doors behind them. Ethan looked at the chains again, then at the frost gathering across her bare hands. And somewhere deep beneath the noise of the station machinery and the screaming wind outside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. Because the worst part wasn't that someone had left her here. The worst part was realizing everyone else had probably walked past her already. Ethan stood there for several long seconds while the cold air hissed through the damaged bay vents around them. The girl's breathing mask crackled weakly with every inhale, the fractured filter struggling to process oxygen through layers of frost. A thin warning light blinked red along the side of the device. Low battery, low airflow, low everything. He swallowed hard and slowly unhooked the thermal pack from his belt. "Do not move," he said quietly. The alien girl stiffened anyway. Her golden eyes tracked every movement of his hands with the kind of fear that came from experience, not imagination. Ethan recognized that look. He had seen it years ago in evacuation shelters during the Europa mining riots. People stopped believing kindness was real after enough bad things happened in a row. He crouched beside the wall bracket holding the chains in place. Cheap corporate restraints. Rusted manual lock. probably meant for livestock transport. Who did this to you? He asked. The girl hesitated before answering. Dock traders. Her voice came out thin beneath the damaged respirator. I was supposed to leave on a freighter 3 days ago. Ethan frowned. 3 days? She gave a weak nod. Transfer denied. His eyes drifted toward the crate markings again. Biological property. The words sat there under the flickering lights like something rotten. He exhaled slowly through his nose and pulled a compact utility cutter from his jacket pocket. The girl's shoulders tightened immediately. Wait, she whispered. If they find out you helped me. Ethan slid the tool against the chain lock. They are not paying me enough to care anymore. Sparks snapped briefly across the metal as the cutter hummed to life. A second later, the restraint released with a heavy clank against the frozen floor. The girl stared down at her freed wrist like she could not quite understand what she was seeing. Ethan removed the second restraint more carefully. Her skin beneath the metal cuffs looked pale and irritated from the cold. He shrugged off his thermal jacket and draped it over her shoulders before she could protest. The oversized fabric nearly swallowed her whole. You are freezing, he muttered. Humans are stubborn about that kind of thing. She looked up at him slowly. Why? Ethan paused. Strange question. Not because he did not understand it. Because he did. Too well. He avoided her eyes and focused on packing away the utility cutter. Because somebody should have come sooner. Silence settled between them while distant machinery groaned somewhere beneath the station floor. Then the overhead speakers crackled alive without warning. Attention maintenance personnel. Dock curfew in effect due to weather instability. Unauthorized activity will be investigated. Ethan's jaw tightened. Great. He glanced toward the bay entrance. Security drones would start sweeping in used sectors soon, especially after a power fluctuation alert. He looked back at the girl. Can you walk? She tried to stand too quickly. The moment pressure hit her legs, she nearly collapsed sideways. Ethan caught her before she hit the floor. She froze in surprise at the contact, staring at his hand gripping her arm like no one had touched her gently in a very long time. Up close, he could see faint silver markings beneath the blue-green tint of her skin, delicate patterns running along her neck like frozen rivers. Alien biology always looked strange under station lighting. Beautiful, too, in a way people rarely admitted out loud. Easy, Ethan said softly. You have probably not eaten much either. She lowered her gaze. That was answer enough. Ethan glanced once more toward the dark corridor outside Bay 14, then back at her exhausted face beneath the broken respirator. He already knew this was a terrible idea. Bringing unauthorized aliens into residential sectors could cost him his housing permit, his work contract, maybe worse. Vera Colony did not like complications. And this girl looked like the kind of complication that could ruin a man's life quietly and completely. Another gust of wind slammed against the outer hull hard enough to shake frost from the ceiling beams overhead. The girl flinched instinctively. Ethan sighed and adjusted the thermal jacket around her shoulders. Come on, he said. My place has heat. Most days. For the first time since he found her, the fear in her eyes weakened slightly. Not gone. Just cracked enough for something else to slip through. Confusion. As if she genuinely could not understand why a stranger would offer warmth without asking for something in return. The residential levels of Vera Station were quieter after curfew. Most workers sealed themselves inside cramped sleeping units once the temperature outside dropped below zero and the windstorms started hammering the outer hull. Ethan guided the girl through the dim corridor with slow steps, keeping his pace steady enough for her to follow. The overhead lights buzzed softly above them, flickering every few seconds from unstable power flow. Somewhere far below, the station reactor hummed like distant thunder beneath layers of steel. The girl stayed close behind him without speaking. Every now and then Ethan caught the sound of her uneven breathing through the cracked respirator. It bothered him more than he expected. The thing was barely functioning. Cheap filter. Old seals. Probably salvaged from scrapyard inventory. By the time they reached his section, frost had already formed along the edges of her silver hair again. Ethan pressed his palm against the apartment scanner beside the door. The lock beeped once before sliding open with a tired mechanical hiss. Warm air rolled into the hallway immediately, carrying the scent of machine oil, old coffee, and heated metal. The girl stopped at the entrance. Her golden eyes moved slowly across the room like she had stepped into another world entirely. Ethan's apartment was small even by colony standards. One narrow sleeping alcove, a battered couch near the wall heater, stacks of repair manuals and spare machine parts covering half the kitchen counter. A faded Earth baseball cap hung beside the door beneath an old emergency responder badge that had not been touched in years. Nothing fancy, nothing worth stealing, but it was warm. That alone made it feel luxurious on Vera Station. Ethan closed the door behind them and locked it manually. "Sit down before you pass out," he muttered. The girl hesitated before lowering herself carefully onto the couch. Her eyes immediately drifted toward the heater vent glowing orange along the floor panel. Ethan crossed the room and grabbed an old thermal blanket from a storage bin near the table. "Here." She stared at the blanket for a second before accepting it slowly with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered. The words sounded unfamiliar in her mouth, like she had not used them often. Ethan moved into the kitchen corner and opened a cabinet above the recycler unit. Half a loaf of ration bread, 1 protein pack, instant soup mix. He frowned slightly. Payday was still 4 days away. Great timing. He filled a metal kettle anyway and set it onto the heating plate. The apartment settled into silence except for the low hum of the vents and the occasional groan of stressed pipes inside the walls. Ethan noticed the girl watching him carefully from the couch. Not fearful this time. Curious. "What?" he asked. Her gaze shifted toward the old responder badge hanging beside the door. "You used to save people." Ethan looked at the badge for a moment before turning back toward the kettle. "Something like that. Then why are you here?" The question landed harder than she probably intended. Ethan leaned both hands against the counter. Outside the small frost-covered window behind him, snow and ash spiraled endlessly through the darkness beyond the station lights. "Because sometimes people die anyway," he said quietly. The girl lowered her eyes immediately, as if she regretted asking. Ethan rubbed a hand across the back of his neck and exhaled slowly. Soup first, existential crises later. To his surprise, the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough to catch him off guard. The kettle clicked softly as steam curled into the room. Ethan poured the soup into a chipped ceramic bowl and carried it over carefully. The girl accepted it with cautious hands, staring down at the rising steam like she had forgotten food could be warm. "Eat slowly," Ethan warned. "Your body is probably running on fumes." She nodded faintly and took a careful sip. The moment the heat touched her throat, her eyes closed briefly. Relief crossed her face so quickly and honestly that Ethan had to look away. Something about that expression bothered him. Nobody should look surprised by kindness. The heater vent crackled softly beneath the couch while snow battered the station walls outside. For the first time in months, Ethan's apartment no longer felt empty. And somehow that scared him more than finding her chained in Bay 14 ever did. The station alarms switched to night cycle around 2 in the morning. The overhead lights outside Ethan's apartment dimmed automatically, leaving only thin blue emergency strips glowing beneath the corridor doors. Inside the small unit, the heater rattled steadily against the cold pressing through the walls from space beyond. Ethan sat at the kitchen counter with a half-disassembled oxygen filter spread across the metal surface beneath a work lamp. Tiny screws rolled near his fingertips while old jazz music played softly through a cracked speaker beside the sink. He had not planned on staying awake this long, but every time he closed his eyes, he kept seeing chains bolted to frozen steel. Across the room, the girl remained curled beneath the thermal blanket on the couch. At some point she had fallen asleep sitting upright, one hand still loosely holding the empty soup bowl against her chest. Ethan glanced toward her again while tightening a replacement seal into the respirator housing. Strange. Even asleep, she looked tense, like her body had forgotten how to rest completely. The silver markings along her neck pulsed faintly beneath the apartment lights, almost like slow-moving reflections beneath water. Alien biology fascinated scientists back on Earth. On Vera Station, it mostly made people nervous. Ethan finished adjusting the respirator components and tested the airflow valve. The machine gave a soft mechanical hum instead of the broken crackling sound from earlier. Better. Not perfect, but enough to keep somebody breathing. He stood quietly and crossed the room. The floor panels creaked under his boots. The girl's eyes snapped open instantly. Fear flooded her face before she fully recognized where she was. Ethan stopped moving immediately. "Easy," he said softly, holding up the repaired respirator. "I fixed the filter." Her breathing slowed after a second. Barely. She sat up slowly beneath the blanket while Ethan crouched beside the couch and handed her the device. "It should not freeze anymore," he explained. "I replaced the airflow regulator." She turned the respirator over carefully in her hands. Her fingers traced the repaired seams with visible confusion. "You repaired it yourself?" "I repair mining equipment for a living." This thing is basically a tiny air recycler with attitude problems. For the first time, she made an actual sound that almost resembled a laugh. Small, quiet, gone too quickly to fully exist. But Ethan heard it anyway. She secured the mask carefully over her face and inhaled once. The damaged, wheezing noise was gone now, replaced by smooth, filtered airflow. Relief softened her expression almost immediately. Better? Ethan asked. She nodded slowly. Much. He leaned back against the couch arm and rubbed tired eyes with one hand. The station pipes groaned softly inside the walls while snow hammered endlessly against the exterior hull. After a long silence, the girl finally spoke again. Why are humans like this? Ethan blinked. Like what? Her golden eyes remained fixed on him. You repair broken things that do not belong to you. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. Guess we are stubborn. No, she whispered. Not stubborn. Her gaze drifted toward the repaired respirator in her hands. Gentle. The word landed strangely in the room. Ethan looked away first. He stood and moved toward the kitchen counter before the silence could become uncomfortable. You got a name? He asked while pouring water into the kettle again. Or should I keep calling you mysterious frozen dock girl? She hesitated. Lyra. Ethan nodded once. Ethan. She repeated it carefully beneath the soft hum of the heater. Ethan. Funny thing about hearing your own name from someone who genuinely meant it. It sounded different somehow. More real. The kettle began to steam quietly while the old jazz track faded into static for a moment. Lyra looked around the apartment again, studying the cluttered shelves, the repair tools, the cracked coffee mugs stacked near the sink. You live here alone? Ethan stared at the rising steam for a second longer than necessary. Yeah. Lyra tilted her head. Slightly. That sounds cold. Ethan almost answered with another joke. Something sarcastic. Something safe. But the words never came. Because the worst part was that she was right. And judging by the look in her eyes, she understood loneliness better than most humans ever would. Morning on Vera Station never really looked like morning. The colony orbited too far from its system star for natural sunlight to reach the lower industrial sectors, so the station simulated daytime through brighter corridor lights and slightly warmer air circulation. Ethan woke to the sound of pipes rattling inside the walls and the faint smell of burned coffee drifting from the auto heater beside his bed. For several seconds, he simply stared at the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of life support systems vibrating through the apartment floor. Then he remembered he was not alone anymore. He sat up immediately. The couch near the heater was empty. Ethan's pulse tightened before he spotted movement near the frost-covered window across the room. Lyra stood quietly beside the glass wearing his oversized thermal jacket, her silver hair glowing softly beneath the pale overhead lights. Beyond the window, snowstorms spiraled endlessly around the station towers while cargo ships drifted through the distance like dim shadows against space. She looked impossibly small standing there. Ethan rubbed sleep from his eyes and stepped out from the sleeping alcove. You are up early, he muttered. Lyra glanced back over her shoulder. I could not sleep much. Nightmares. She hesitated before answering. Memories. Ethan nodded once. Fair enough. The coffee machine hissed beside him while he pulled two old ceramic mugs from the cabinet. One of them had a chipped blue stripe running down the side. The other read World's Okayest Mechanic in faded white lettering. Lyra watched him curiously as he poured steaming coffee into one mug and heated nutrient tea into the other. Humans consume stimulants every morning? She asked. Religiously. He handed her the tea carefully. Most of us stop functioning without caffeine. She accepted the mug with both hands, studying the rising steam like it fascinated her. Ethan leaned against the counter and took a slow sip of coffee. The bitter taste grounded him, made the apartment feel normal again even though nothing about the situation was normal anymore. Lyra wandered slowly through the room afterward, pausing near shelves crowded with machine parts, old tools, and stacks of paper books most people on the station considered obsolete. Her fingers brushed lightly across a worn photograph sitting near the radio. Ethan noticed immediately. In the picture, a younger version of himself stood beside a smiling dark-haired woman wearing emergency response gear. Snow covered their shoulders while rescue transports hovered in the background. Lyra looked back at him carefully. She mattered to you. Ethan stared into his coffee for a second too long. My sister. Lyra lowered the photo gently. What happened? The station heater clicked softly behind them. Ethan exhaled through his nose and stared toward the frosted window instead of answering immediately. Mining collapse on Europa Colony 6 years ago, he said quietly. Emergency teams got there late. Lyra's expression softened almost instantly. I am sorry. Ethan shrugged, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, me too. Silence settled over the apartment again. Not awkward this time. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that existed between two people carrying different versions of the same loneliness. Lyra moved toward the radio near the kitchen counter a moment later. Soft jazz drifted from the speaker beneath layers of static. This music sounds old, she said. It is. Ethan smirked faintly. Earth was obsessed with sad songs long before space travel. To his surprise, Lyra tilted her head slightly and listened more closely. I think I like it. Ethan blinked once. Seriously? It sounds, she searched for the word. Warm. That one word hit him harder than it should have. Warm. Not advanced. Not efficient. Not beautiful. Warm. Outside, snow hammered endlessly against the station walls while cold white storms swallowed the stars beyond the glass. But inside the cramped apartment, beside old music and rattling heaters and cheap instant coffee, something unfamiliar had started, growing quietly between them. Not romance, not destiny, just the dangerous, fragile feeling of two lonely people beginning to trust each other. 3 days passed before the station finally noticed something was missing. Ethan was halfway through repairing a coolant regulator inside Processing Sector 2 when every screen in the maintenance bay suddenly flickered red. Workers around him groaned in annoyance as the colony broadcast interrupted their shift music. A corporate insignia rotated slowly across the monitor before a cold female voice filled the room. Attention, all station personnel. An unauthorized alien lifeform classified as restricted biological property has escaped containment. Report suspicious activity immediately. A reward of 2 million credits has been authorized for verified recovery assistance. Ethan's wrench slipped in his hand. Around him, several mechanics immediately started talking over each other. 2 million. What kind of alien is worth that? Probably military tech. Ethan forced himself to keep working while the announcement continued repeating through the station speakers. He could feel sweat forming beneath the collar of his work jacket despite the freezing air circulating through the bay. 2 million credits. Enough to leave Vera forever. Enough to buy transport back to Earth. Enough to never crawl through another frozen maintenance shaft again. The thought made him feel sick almost immediately. That night the station corridors felt different. Tighter somehow. Security drones hovered near elevator junctions, while patrol officers questioned workers returning from late shifts. Searchlights swept slowly across docking sectors beyond the windows. Ethan kept his head down during the walk home, hands shoved into his pockets against the cold. Snowstorms still raged outside the station hall, wrapping the colony in endless white static. By the time he reached his apartment, exhaustion sat heavy in his bones. The door slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. Warm air greeted him first, then the smell of soup. Ethan stopped in the doorway. Lyra stood near the small kitchen heater stirring something carefully inside a dented metal pot. She looked up the moment he entered. You are late, she said quietly. Ethan stared at her for a second longer than necessary. The apartment lights reflected softly against her silver hair, while old jazz drifted from the radio beside the sink. Somehow the place already looked less empty than it used to. That realization unsettled him more every day. Station security is crawling everywhere, he muttered while hanging his jacket near the door. They finally realized you disappeared. Lyra's hand slowed slightly against the spoon. I know. Ethan frowned. You heard the broadcast? She nodded once. The walls in this station are thin. Silence settled heavily between them. Ethan moved toward the window and looked out across the industrial towers beyond the frost-covered glass. Search drones drifted through the storm outside like pale floating eyes. 2 million credits, he said quietly. That is enough money to change a life here. Lyra lowered her gaze toward the soup pot. Then perhaps you should take it. Ethan turned sharply. What? She kept stirring slowly without looking at him. You have shown me more kindness in 3 days than most people in my entire life. I do not want your future destroyed because of me. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. You think I am going to sell you? No, she whispered. That is what frightens me. The room fell silent except for the soft bubbling of soup and the distant hum of station machinery beneath the floor. Ethan rubbed tired hands across his face. Lyra. She finally looked at him then. Her golden eyes carried something fragile now. Not fear. Worse. Acceptance. Like she had already decided she was not worth saving. Ethan hated that expression immediately. Hated how familiar it looked. He remembered seeing the same hollow resignation on exhausted evacuees years ago after rescue ships stopped arriving. People eventually learn to expect abandonment. Listen to me carefully, Ethan said softly. You are not a paycheck. Lyra blinked once, visibly startled by the firmness in his voice. Ethan stepped closer and lowered his tone. I do not care what they call you. Property, cargo, whatever corporate garbage they stamped onto a crate. You are a person. The words seemed to hit her harder than he expected. She stared at him completely, still while the heater crackled softly nearby. Then, very slowly, her eyes began to shine with restrained emotion. Not dramatic, not loud, just quiet disbelief. Like nobody had ever spoken about her that way before. Outside the station, snowstorms swallowed the stars beyond the glass. But inside the tiny apartment filled with old music and cheap soup and flickering heater light, something invisible shifted between them forever. The knock came at 1:17 in the morning. 3 sharp hits against the apartment door. Not loud. Professional. Ethan froze halfway through cleaning dishes at the sink while Lyra looked up instantly from the couch. The jazz music still playing softly through the radio suddenly sounded much too loud. Another knock followed. Station security. A voice called from the hallway. Routine residence verification. Ethan's stomach tightened hard enough to hurt. Lyra stood immediately, panic flashing across her face. Ethan moved toward her before she could speak. Bedroom, he whispered. Now. She hesitated only half a second before disappearing silently into the sleeping alcove. Ethan grabbed the thermal blanket from the couch and tossed it over the second mug sitting near the heater. Then he crossed the apartment and opened the door halfway. A security officer stood outside beneath the corridor lights wearing gray station armor dusted with melting frost. Behind him hovered a compact surveillance drone no bigger than a basketball, its blue scanner beam moving slowly across the hallway walls. Mr. Ethan Cole? The officer asked. That depends, Ethan muttered. Is this about unpaid maintenance reports again? The officer did not smile. They rarely did. There has been unusual movement detected in this residential sector over the last 72 hours. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the doorway casually, even though his pulse hammered against his ribs. You tracked unusual movement on a station with 9,000 exhausted miners and 300 leaking pipe systems. Congratulations. The drone floated slightly higher beside the officer, scanner beam flickering toward the apartment interior. Ethan subtly shifted position to block more of the room. Mind if we come in? The officer asked. Very much. Silence stretched between them. Somewhere deeper in the station, warning sirens echoed faintly through ventilation shafts while the storm outside rattled the corridor walls. The officer studied Ethan carefully. You worked docking sector 9 3 nights ago. So did half the maintenance crew. Bay 14 reported a power disruption shortly before the containment breach. Ethan shrugged. Old wiring. The drone emitted a soft electronic chirp. Ethan could feel sweat gathering beneath the back of his shirt despite the freezing corridor air. Then, from inside the apartment, a glass suddenly shattered. Loud. Sharp. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Fantastic. The officer's gaze sharpened immediately. You alone in there? Ethan sighed heavily and rubbed his forehead like an exhausted man at the end of a terrible shift. Which, to be fair, he was. Look, he muttered. My ex-girlfriend is drunk again, and if you walk in there right now, you are volunteering for a 4-hour emotional hostage situation about commitment issues. The officer blinked once. Behind him, even the drone seemed uncertain. Ethan lowered his voice conspiratorially. Trust me, you do not want that paperwork. For several painful seconds, nobody moved. Then finally the officer exhaled through his nose. Keep your resident ID active tonight. Curfew inspections may continue. Wonderful. I will light candles. The officer gave him one final suspicious look before turning down the corridor. The drone hovered after him, scanner light fading slowly into the distance. Ethan waited until they disappeared around the corner before shutting the door carefully. The apartment fell completely silent. Then the bedroom curtain shifted slightly, and Lyra stepped out slowly, eyes wide with shock. Ethan leaned both hands against the door and let out a long breath. You broke a glass? Lyra looked genuinely horrified. I panicked. Fair. She stared at him for a moment longer before speaking quietly. You lied for me, without hesitation. Ethan rubbed tired eyes. Yeah, well, I have always been a terrible role model. But Lyra was still watching him with that same expression from earlier. That dangerous look of disbelief people got when kindness stopped feeling temporary. Ethan noticed her hands trembling slightly. Not from fear this time. Relief. He crossed the room and handed her a fresh towel from the kitchen counter. You okay? Lyra accepted it slowly. No one has ever protected me before. The words landed softly in the room beneath the hum of heaters and distant station machinery. Ethan looked away first, because the frightening thing was not that he had lied to station security. The frightening thing was realizing he would probably do something far worse if it meant keeping her safe. The station power failed 43 minutes later. 1 second the apartment glowed with soft yellow heater light and old jazz humming through the radio. The next, everything vanished into darkness. The vents died with a metallic groan. The heater shut down. Silence swallowed the room, so completely Ethan could hear snow scraping across the outer hull somewhere beyond the walls. Great, he muttered into the dark. That is never a good sound. Emergency lights flickered on a few seconds later, washing the apartment in dim red illumination. The effect transformed the tiny room into something colder and unfamiliar. Frost immediately began creeping across the corners of the window glass as the temperature dropped. Ethan crossed toward the utility cabinet near the kitchen and pulled out a portable heat lamp along with 2 old emergency thermal packs. Grid overload, he said while activating the heater. Storm probably knocked out half the outer sectors. The small lamp cast a weak orange glow across the apartment, barely enough to push back the cold. Lyra stood near the couch watching him quietly, silver markings along her neck reflecting faintly beneath the emergency lighting. Does this happen often? She asked. Only when the station wants us to remember we are all one mechanical failure away from dying dramatically. To his surprise, Lyra almost smiled again. Ethan handed her one of the thermal packs before kneeling. Beside the radio, static hissed through the speaker now, broken by fragments of emergency broadcasts. Attention residents, a distorted voice crackled. Temporary power conservation protocols are now in effect. Non-essential systems will remain offline until further notice. Ethan sighed softly. Could be hours. He adjusted the radio frequency again, trying to find a stable channel. Instead, another broadcast suddenly pushed through the static. Reward increased to 3 million credits. Ethan froze. Lyra did too. The distorted transmission continued. Restricted alien life form considered medically unstable and potentially hazardous. Citizens are advised not to provide shelter. Ethan shut the radio off immediately. Silence rushed back into the apartment. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Lyra lowered her gaze toward the floor. There it is. Ethan frowned. What? The truth. Her voice sounded smaller somehow beneath the dim red lighting. They finally called me what I am. Ethan leaned back against the cabinet slowly. Hazardous, he muttered. You nearly apologized for taking soup. Lyra shook her head faintly. You do not understand. She moved toward the frost-covered window, wrapping the thermal blanket tighter around herself, while snowstorms spiraled outside beyond the glass. My species does not tolerate imperfection, she said quietly. Sickness weakens genetic continuity. Emotional instability weakens social structure. We remove things that threaten efficiency. Ethan listened without interrupting. I was born with a neurological condition, Lyra continued. It affects cellular regulation. My body deteriorates slowly during extreme environmental stress. Ethan's expression tightened slightly. That is why they kept you sedated in transport. She nodded once. Most people believed I should have been euthanized after diagnosis. The words landed in the room with horrifying calmness, like she had repeated them enough times to stop feeling their weight. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. You were sick, he said softly. Not dangerous. Lyra gave a faint, humorless smile toward the storm outside. To my people, those are sometimes the same thing. The emergency heat lamp crackled quietly between them. Ethan looked at her standing there beneath the red station lights, shoulders tense beneath his oversized jacket, staring out at a universe that had apparently spent her entire life treating compassion like a design flaw. Something hot and angry twisted inside his chest. Not rage. Worse, sadness. Because suddenly he understood why she looked confused every time someone showed her basic kindness. Nobody ever had. Ethan stood slowly and crossed the room until he stopped beside her at the window. Snow and frozen ash drifted endlessly across the blackness outside like ghosts caught in orbit. You know, he said quietly, humans are kind of a mess too. Lyra glanced at him carefully. Ethan shrugged one shoulder. We break constantly. Physically, emotionally, mentally. Half our history is basically people making terrible decisions under pressure. That finally pulled the smallest real smile from her. Ethan leaned lightly against the frozen glass beside her. But we figured something out a long time ago. What? He looked at the reflection of the storm swirling across the window. People should not have to earn the right to be cared about. Lyra stared at him in complete silence after that. And somewhere beyond the station walls, beneath endless snow and dying stars, something inside her finally began to thaw. The evacuation shuttle arrived during the quietest part of the station cycle. Outside the apartment window, the storm had finally weakened enough for distant docking lights to appear through the snow like blurred stars beneath frozen glass. Ethan stood near the kitchen counter finishing the last connection on a portable signal beacon while Lyra watched silently from the couch. The emergency heat lamp still filled the apartment with soft orange light, casting long shadows across the walls. Neither of them had slept. Around 4 in the morning, an encrypted transmission had slipped through the station frequencies. Independent medical transport. No corporate affiliation. One ship. One chance. Ethan tightened the final wire, and the beacon emitted a low green pulse. That should guide them into docking sector 3, he said quietly. Lyra lowered her eyes. You did all of this overnight. Turns out insomnia can be productive. But his voice sounded tired even to himself. The truth sat heavily between them now. Once the shuttle arrived, she would leave. The apartment would become quiet again. Empty again. Ethan was surprised by how much he already hated that idea. A low vibration suddenly rolled through the station floor beneath their feet. Incoming thrusters. Lyra looked toward the frost-covered window instinctively. Ethan checked the time display beside the radio. That is them. Neither moved immediately. The heater crackled softly, while distant docking sirens echoed somewhere through the lower sectors. Finally, Ethan grabbed his old thermal jacket from beside the door and held it out toward her. You should keep this. Lyra blinked in surprise. Ethan, this is yours. Yeah, and you are heading onto a medical transport through a snowstorm. Trust me, the universe is still cold out there. She accepted the jacket carefully, fingers brushing the worn fabric like it mattered far more than it should have. Then she looked up at him with an expression he could not quite survive seeing. I do not know how to thank you. Ethan shrugged lightly. You already did. How? He glanced around the apartment. At the untouched coffee mug beside the sink. The old jazz radio still humming softly beneath static. The room that somehow felt alive again for the first time in years. You reminded me I was still human. Silence settled gently between them after that. Not painful, just full. Ethan opened the apartment door and cold corridor air rolled inside immediately. Together they walked through the sleeping residential sector beneath dim blue station lights. Snow tapped softly against the outer hull, while distant machinery vibrated beneath the floor panels. When they reached docking sector 3, the shuttle already waited beyond the bay windows. Small, white, medical insignias glowing along the hull beneath swirling frost. A ramp extended slowly toward the docking platform. Lyra stopped walking. Ethan did too. Around them, the station remained strangely quiet. No alarms. No security drones. Just the soft mechanical hiss of the docking clamps locking into place. Lyra turned toward him slowly. Her silver hair moved gently in the recycled station air while snow drifted beyond the glass behind her. My people spent my entire life teaching me that weakness makes someone worthless, she whispered. Ethan looked at her without speaking. Then I met a human mechanic living alone at the edge of nowhere, she continued softly. And he treated me like I mattered before he even knew my name. Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest. Lyra stepped closer then, close enough for him to see faint gold reflections dancing inside her eyes from the docking lights. I think, she said quietly, that your species survives because you care about things logic tells you not to. Ethan laughed once under his breath. Honestly, that explains most of human history. For the first time since Bay 14, Lyra smiled without sadness behind it. A real smile. Small, warm, human. The shuttle crew signaled from the ramp a moment later. Time. Lyra looked toward the ship, then back at Ethan one final time. Will I see you again? She asked. Ethan opened his mouth automatically, ready with some safe answer about probabilities and distance and space being too large for stories like this. But none of it felt true anymore. So instead he simply said, I hope so. Lyra nodded once. Then she stepped onto the shuttle ramp, wearing his oversized jacket beneath falling snow and pale docking lights. Ethan remained there long after the hatch closed behind her. Long after the engines ignited. Long after the small white ship disappeared beyond the storm outside the station walls. And standing alone beneath the frozen lights of Vera Station, Ethan finally understood something simple and terrifying. He had not saved a soldier, or a princess, or the galaxy. Just one lonely girl the universe decided was not worth keeping. And somehow, that had become enough.